Hello and welcome, everyone. I see we have people continuing to join right now, so to be timely, I will jump right into it. Hopefully everybody can hear me and see me okay. And today's topic is on the 5 steps to nailing your board director interview. Now, many months ago, I had written an article on this same topic, and the requests came in, multiple requests came in to do a speaking engagement or a webinar on this topic. Hence, that led to today's webinar. And I hope you enjoyed. I think whether you're an aspiring director or an experienced director, you'll find some value to this. Remember, before we get started here too, that making a great impression that leads to a resounding yes should really be coming from both sides of the table. It's not just you waiting for the invitation to join the board. You also want to make sure you're doing your due diligence and your homework on evaluating if that board is a right fit for you. We'll talk about some of those topics today as well. Quick introduction. I am Mark Pfister. I am CEO and Chief Board Consultant of M.A. Pfister Strategy Group. I'm a governance and strategy expert, a non-executive director, and the Chief Board Consultant of this organization. I've become known as the board architect. I was introduced in a speaking engagement some years ago, and that kind of stuck. I do like it. And my book, which came out in 2018, Across the Board, The Modern Architecture Behind an Effective Board of Directors. It's actually for a topic that's very specific, has done quite well. It's in 70 countries now. And I believe it to be the only in-depth book that's been written on the structuring, or what I like to call the architecture of boards. For today's topic, I think it's also worthwhile mentioning that I've worked with over 100 nominating committees over the past decade. And I think that's important due to the fact that you start to see trending, and this is for public, private, and nonprofit organizations, probably a fairly equal mix across those organizations. So you start to see trends, you start to see things that make sense, the questions that are being asked, and even responses from board candidates that you are impressed by. I make notes of those things and keep them for future publications or writings, or even a book, my next book I'm working on right now. But I hope you get some of the value from this trending and what I've seen in working with a considerable number of nominating committees, both in the process aspect of creating the processes and rolling them out for these organizations, as well as in the vetting of board candidates. So a few frequently asked questions. We'll just start out with these, which will make the webinar a little bit smoother. The purpose for today, again, is for me to share knowledge on successful elements of board candidate interviews. It's really to get you to the point where you're making a very memorable impression. If you do have questions, please write them in the Q&A section. We always have time at the end of these, so I'll answer those. If we do have questions we can't get to, I'll follow up with emails afterwards. The materials, yes, you can see the entire webinar, the recording, as well as this presentation. I'll send a link out within a day or two to everybody on this webinar, and you'll be able to view those as well as download the presentation file if you like. Also know that on almost every page, or most pages of this presentation, there's additional topic references, and I put links in here. So when you do get access to this file, you'll be able to click on areas to other articles or programs that can help you in digging down further into information if it indeed is an area that you're interested in finding out more information about. So when you get the presentation, you'll see those links and you'll be able to click on those areas. So just to cover some of the goals for today, the considerations and learning the important board interview topic points of coverage. This obviously is what you're here for today. And then allowing yourself the time beforehand, even now at this point, in being able to prepare an impressive response and show your presence as a board director, knowing that whether you drive some of these questions or if the interviewer drives these questions, that you're fully prepared and you understand if you want to take that question to a deeper level, you know how to drive it to that depth and to that level you want to take it to get across the points that show that you are a savvy board candidate and board director. So we're going to do this by really touching on 5 areas, and really for what to walk away with from today's discussion, it's these 5 areas I'd love you to think about as you go through your board director career. Again, whether you're aspiring or even an experienced board directors are also changing their mindset currently in how these interviews are happening, so they stay viable as future board directors, even if they have years of experience beforehand. So we'll start out with what I call the question of values. We'll move that to enhancing the fit, which is really how are you ensuring that you're a fit for this board, and going above and beyond just what that board is asking for in terms of skill set or experience. We'll talk a little bit about that. Strategy and governance, for those that know me well, you know that I won't do any webinars or teaching events or educational events without touching on strategy and governance. In this case, I want you to know that I say here strategy and governance is indivisible, meaning that they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other in the boardroom. The learning mentality is another deeply entrained aspect of looking for viable board directors. And then I want to talk about the other intelligences. And just as a starting point, think about EQ, emotional intelligence, think about MQ, mindfulness intelligence. And I'll show where that sort of fits into the overall board candidates, both inherently in the board candidate, as well as how either you're answering questions in a way that show those intelligences, or you're driving, again, that conversation or that interview yourself to the level of getting across your EQ and your MQ levels. All right. Let me start out with a few intro areas as well, just to get us to the point of talking directly about the interview. So first and foremost, some months ago in May of 2020, I did a small poll across multiple platforms. That includes LinkedIn. It's board directors I've worked with or sat on boards with in the past. And I simply posed the question, as an aspiring director, hopefully you're inspiring as well, but as an aspiring director or an experienced director, do you feel prepared to represent yourself effectively in a modern board interview? And I wasn't surprised, number one, to see that we came back with half of the folks, and many of them being experienced board directors, did not feel confident currently in representing themselves in what's viewed as a modern day board interview. I would tell you through my experience, the number of yeses is probably inflated a little bit more as well, because I see that even folks that believe that they are prepared, I can catch them with 1 or 2 questions that I view as fairly simple, whether it relates to strategy and governance or even in their leadership style. So I believe that that number probably is a little bit greater in the no area as compared to the yes. But just know when people are rating themselves, it's usually a 50-50 split in how they think that they are ready to effectively present themselves in a modern board interview. And as we talk about this, I want to also get across the point that before you get to the interview, just a quick overview of the prerequisites. We can't get into too much detail on this, but know that before you get the interview, the largest hurdle for most board candidates is actually getting to the interview. And the question usually is, why is this? And it's because most aspiring as well as experienced directors are not aware of proper and modern board candidate packaging principles. So what I'm talking about here is the aspects of, are you still submitting a normal resume or CV for a board position, right? There actually is no such thing. You send what's called board documents, which is a board bio, and a board document, which is very specific in its layout. So I can tell you, I can weed through, and it's a task of what I'm doing for one of my clients in the consulting realm this week. I need to get through by Friday 800 different submissions of potential candidates for one open board seat. I already know that those that have submitted even the file name on the file name in their email to me, if it says resume or CV, I'm not opening those first, because I already know I'm looking for those that have labeled their file name properly and called this a board document, which is what it is. Also, getting to the interview, again, the prerequisite. making the mistake of not correlating your personal values to the organization's values. We're going to talk about that in a moment as it relates to your interview. Focusing too much on governance and ignoring strategy. We're going to speak also today at the interview level of how to position that and speak about that properly. Missing the entire package to me is really not looking at board directorship above and beyond just your role as sitting on a board. What other things are you doing? Are you involved in teaching? Are you hosting webinars, as an example? Are you being quoted in articles? How are you furthering the industry or the vertical of board directorship? And then the overall aspect of making the mistake of delegating or avoiding the creation of your board director brand. And I personally believe that you need to create a brand around your specific prowess in the board director vertical. And a big mistake here is that many folks believe that they're going to simply enter their data into the databases of the search and placement firms for boards or executive placement firms, and they're going to sit back and wait for things to happen. I can tell you that the level of success in that process is extremely low. You need to take that into your own hands and drive that creation of your brand forward. Again, we're not going to get into too much of this now, but if you're interested, when you get a copy of the presentation, you can click on links on each one of these pages. In this case, this top 5 mistakes board directors make, and drill further down into how to do these things. So again, for the remainder of our discussion today, we're going to assume that you've packaged yourself properly and you got called for an interview. And now we're moving into that interview. So let's start out first and foremost with the question of values. And what do we actually mean by this? So rule number 1, the positioning of board and organization values. So the organization you're interviewing with, are you actually aligning that to your personal values? Number 1, making sure that they are your personal values even before you say yes to the interview. And then when you're in the interview, are you able to make those correlations and truly make the commitment to the values of that organization? I'm going to show you why this is so important at multiple levels for a board candidate. So initially, and I do this in the interviews that I partake in, I laser focus the interview discussion on the values component early on, which means that if you are in an interview where someone is not doing that, you want to in some way get across the fact of your values being superimposed and in alignment to the organization and the board's values. And it does a couple things in an interview and the way you represent yourself. Number 1, you're obviously validating that you have a values alignment to that organization. Great starting point. It also exhibits your integrity and your purpose in what you do. I'm a firm believer that you have to have a purpose in what you do to do it well. So by talking about values, that's a prime example of showing that you have integrity and you have purpose and you have a way of measuring it. And all of this comes down to confirming your depth of character, which to me, the character of somebody, as we all know, is likely one of the most important components of anybody. So even if you come to me with 50 years of experience in a specific area that's important to the board, but you lack character, to me, you're not even on the consideration list because, again, character, I believe, is one of the most important areas. So savvy search and placement companies, as well as mature nominating committees, they understand that aligned values are the foundation for a strong culture. And the board is the owner of this responsibility. So it makes sense that the board should be checking these areas of values in any candidate that comes to them. The overall concept here is that values equals the culture, which the culture, then the proper culture, lowers organizational risk. Another foundational area of focus for someone that's in governance, knowing that this relationship exists and it's extremely important. And why is this? It's because that values sits at the top of the, even above vision and mission and your objectives, it sits above those areas because it points out and fortifies what do we stand for. So there's no better way, again, of understanding a board candidate through their ethics, their principles and beliefs, through their values, and making that comparison to the company and the board's values, their ethics, their principles and beliefs. So whether it's from an interviewer's standpoint or approach, or from a board director's standpoint or approach, this conversation on the values area should be touched on extremely early in the conversation. Even if you are not being asked the question, bring this up in your interview early on. I will tell you that I'm extremely skeptical, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, of a senior level leader that is not laser focused on the values of the organization, because they know that creates the culture again, and they also know that that lowers organization risk when that's correct. Now, when it comes down to another overlay or comparison of this, when we talk about values and we think about the board director's decisioning process, right? So all of us at senior levels of leadership should have a decision flow of how we work things. This decision flow at the C level and the executive or the board level is very different in many cases for most organizations as it is at management or employee levels. Now, it's not to say that values aren't important, but in many cases, those values and the governance of those values and the way the values have been built into the strategy of the organization, the board and the C level owns that. So if we again go back to the importance of values and we look at this from a board director's decisioning process, we know that values is the first vetting point for any decision that's being made inside and outside the boardroom for a board director or someone at the C level. And this is just an excerpt from my coaching and my certification course that I offer for those that are packaging themselves for consideration in the board space. I drive this home because you have to get this point across, and that your decisioning process is starting at the beginning at the level of values. And you'll be very surprised if you do this correctly, how many things you can say no to because they simply don't fit the values of the board of the organization or you yourself in comparing back to your personal values. Very important concept to know and to abide by as a board director. So again, as me doing the interviews, I'm always looking again to see, are they incorporating the values above and beyond just something that's on a website that says it's a nice to have these things and we push your organization. You want the values to drive deeper into the organization, and you need to make sure that that starts with the board because they own it. A few other quick things on the values before we jump to number two. As I mentioned, I've become personally wary of board candidates or even seated board directors who in their first 3 to 5 questions or comments, they don't directly address the company's values or even their personal values or make the comparison at any point throughout a conversation. I can tell you, for me, this has become an extremely accurate bellwether that points to a lack of fundamental governance knowledge, and it commonly leads to future misalignment of interests. So take this and use it to your advantage. Know that if you're on the receiving end of the interview side of the table, you want to make sure that you're driving home the values component and its relationship with the culture of the organization. All right, I'm going to keep a watch of the time here as well. Enhancing the fit. So you want to be able to show exactly where and how you fit and will elevate the board. Now, some of you are probably thinking right now, when I say that, well, if a board is calling me in for an interview, they already know where they want me to fit. And my answer to that is yes, they commonly have an understanding of what expertise and experience they want you to fit, right? But I want to show you how you can drive that to a deeper level and show other fits that you can point out that makes you a great candidate for a board. And again, this is something that's extremely powerful to do as someone being interviewed for a board seat, where you're coming prepared to show the additional value that you can bring to this board. So first and foremost, know, and again, with my background in my writings in board architecture or the structural areas, I want you to, at a very high level, to understand there's really 3 proper ways that a board is built. And I'm going to compare this back in a moment to how you can align to this. So number 1 is your vertical considerations. This is called your sphere of influence. And again, this is commonly touching on the board's expertise or the individual board director's expertise and experience areas. Again, your vertical considerations. Most boards are focused on this. Most boards are only focused on this, which is part of the problem. But you as a board candidate want to add a little more depth and a little more character to this, which brings me to the horizontal considerations. The horizontal considerations we call planes of congruence, which basically means they're other considerations that span across the entire board. And this is what I like to call the board's character. We're going to talk about this in a moment of how you can add to this. Common examples of this are looking for balances of personality types on boards. If there's a diversity goal you're looking to meet on a board, your approach or your demeanor, such as an analyst, are you an analyst, a diplomat, a sentinel, or an explorer? And then bringing other expertise areas of say, deep knowledge in strategic planning or deep knowledge in governance, which, by the way, just because you're an executive or even a current board member does not mean you're an expert in governance, and definitely does not mean you're an expert in strategy. I view those as their own expertise areas of training and even certification. Then we move to depth considerations, and this is coverage and what's called coverage and balance, and it adds depth to the board. Very high level, common example of this is saying that instead of only having one technology expert on the board that has cybersecurity experience, we want to make sure we have one other board member that, in addition to their primary expertise area, they also have some level of technology and maybe cybersecurity experience. Not to the same level that the expert or the subject matter expert board director has, but enough to get to the point where they can have a discussion and a debate back and forth, and it's not just one person on the board that's offering input. So taking these considerations here of your of the architectural, the proper architecture of a board, number one, use it to your advantage to see, is the board you're going to potentially join, are they more than just I call it the one-hit wonder with only looking at the sphere of influence or the expertise areas. I can tell you that's not going to be a very successful board to join because they lack character and they lack depth. So where we want to add to this is into the character area. And I want to talk about that for a moment. So again, most boards have a fairly good idea of the skill set and experience level they desire in a board candidate. That's the sphere of influence, vertical expertise. But most boards sorely lack in the understanding of how a new member can enhance the character and depth of the overall board. So what I'm proposing here is that you want to be prepared to speak above and beyond just the expertise area of that particular slice of the pie that you fit into in the sphere of influence of that board. So you can do that by performing a study of the existing board's expertise, just to see, again, where you do fit for the expertise area and where you're being asked to fill the gap. But also do a little bit more research in what we're calling this horizontal and the depth makeup, highlighting exactly where you envision your enhanced fit and potentially filling some other gaps that are unknown to the board. Most boards, some will lack an area of expertise that they're not aware of, and this is something I just see in over and over in my consulting realm. But where they're not thinking about has to do with personality balances on the board. Someone coming in with in-depth knowledge in an area that they haven't thought about where expertise is needed. Those types of areas. Okay, so hopefully we're touching on areas that are adding some value right now. And be open to bringing these things up during your interview. Commonly at either the middle or the end of an interview, there are questions. And I can tell you, I respect those that come to board interviews with a significant number of questions, especially if they are at the level that's expected of a board director and they are valid questions on things that are affected by the board. Don't be scared to bring a list with you when you go to a board interview. All right. This moves us into rule number 3, strategy and governance indivisible. So making extremely clear in your interview your proficiency in the interrelational understanding between strategy and governance. This is one that trips up most board candidates in their interviews. And I'm not, again, just talking about aspiring directors. I'm also talking about experienced directors. So knowing that they go hand in hand at the board level is extremely important. And I'm going to explain why this is. So all too often, a board candidate's claim in an interview of being highly adept in governance is followed with clear lack of strategy or strategic understanding when probed more deeply. So this to me is a problem because you're claiming that you are a senior level executive and at the board level, but you're not touching on or understanding or conveying that you understand the relationship between strategy and governance. So let's start out at the highest level of understanding what strategy is. And this diagram and the next page we're going to look at is the simplest way to view where strategy fits. So strategy is a double pointed arrow that sits between goals and tasks. And you may even replace the word tasks with milestones if you're tracking at the board level or the executive level, the accomplishments basically. So number one, if someone's calling you to a strategic planning meeting, just as a side note, they call you to a strategic planning meeting, your first question of them should be, send me the goals, give me time to review, and then I will join your strategic planning meeting. Because you can't technically hold a strategic planning meeting if the goals have not been defined, right? So that's the most basic concept of strategy and where it fits. You can't have one without the other, and the goals have to be there first. Now, board directors must be knowledgeable and skilled in both governance and strategy. The main point being that it's impossible to properly apply governance methodologies and systems when you don't understand what the strategy is, or you don't understand how the strategy operates. So I'm once again, I'm dumbfounded by directors or those in senior positions that tell me that they have a 99% or 90+% governance role. My next question for them is either what is the strategy, or how have you integrated that with the strategy? And you'd be amazed at how many people can't answer that. Know that at the higher levels of either executive or board roles, they require this deep understanding of strategy and governance and the interrelationship. And to drill a little bit deeper on this, and this is something over the years that I've honed and put together as the simplest viewpoint of what does strategy and governance actually mean. This is a way of thinking about this. So at the principal level, you're simply dividing actions or effort or input between objective and action. At the leadership level, you're defining at the goals, or the comparison to the goals, the what and why. The strategy is solely the how. How are we going to get this done? And the tasks or the milestones become the when and possibly the who, depending on what level your governance drills down to. Now, at the board level or the C level, we look at governance and we say, okay, once the goals are set, whether the board has had input or guided this, or the CEO has set the goals and the board approved it, doesn't matter. But on an ongoing basis, at a governance level, it is the importance and the responsibility of the board to set and then ensure the relevance of those goals. Then the governance component comes in on an ongoing basis to validate the strategy, which is really validating the approach. Are we still going down the same path? Is that path the proper way to go? Are there new technologies that are available to us to speed up this process? It may raise our budget slightly, but it lessens our time frame. Right? And then the tasks or the milestones are the way to measure progress. This is the simplest viewpoint to get to the understanding of a board candidate's understanding of strategy and governance and how they interrelate. I will tell you, I reference back to this diagram probably on a weekly basis, just to make sure I'm policing myself in the interaction and the strategy and governance areas that I work with. So I highly recommend you leverage this same diagram and use it to your advantage. It's a great way of helping to police yourself that you're at the right level of your, not at management, but at leadership level for the things that you're attempting to do. And then you're governing them based on the delivery mechanisms. Okay, I'm sure there's likely going to be some questions on this, but we'll get to those as we close the webinar. All right, so again, deeply prepare yourself for questions in the strategy governance area, inclusive of researching anything published on the organization strategy prior to the interview. So this is not just about your understanding and prowess in the strategy and governance area. It's also about making the real life references and the correlations and the comparisons to the organization that you want to be on the board of, comparing your expertise to what they're currently doing, or driving this conversation in the interview down to maybe some nitty-gritty points of the strategy and their goal setting and how they're governing this. So you can then add in areas of how your expertise at your horizontal level, remember we're talking about your planes of congruence level right now, you can add the value above and beyond your vertical expertise area, but now you're drilling down into other areas that are super important to the board. I like to call them your horizontals. Okay, so a good interviewer, be prepared for this. A good interviewer that's interviewing a board candidate And I do this because I actually like to see the responses to this. I take the approach of alternating questions between strategic and tactical. So think about this. One is a very high level question. I'm looking for the ability for someone to go to the leadership level or the governance level or the high strategy level in their answer. And then I'll throw in a question that could seem quite tactical, right? And I try to see if that person is able to either acknowledge, or that candidate is able to acknowledge that I'm jumping back and forth, and to also see if they regress, quite frankly, back into answers that are too tactical based on my tactical question. I want to see them drive the level of the discussion back up to governance and strategy, because I'm going to expect that of them to do in the boardroom. I want to see the examples of this, and this is an easy way for an interviewer to see and experience that. And if the candidate can't do that, I know that they could be a derailer in the boardroom and just go way too tactical or down to a task level. I also jump back and forth in my questioning between strategic versus governance scenarios. And what I'm looking for in this is I want the candidate to bring me back to the holistic and interrelationship between those two. If I ask a strategy question and you as a candidate only stick on strategy for the remainder of your answer, I already know you're not thinking of the interrelationship between strategy and governance. Also, vice versa, if I go to the governance question and you haven't linked that back to strategy or goal setting, I know again that you're not thinking in depth at the leadership or the governance level simply by those questions. And I also want to see here that you're getting the hint that I want you to help me drive your answers to my questions when I do go very tactical by design. I want to see that you're able to drive those again back to the higher level that I would expect of a board director. So I'm looking for that noses in, fingers out approach and how you're bringing that conversation back to that level. These are some of the tricks of the trade in the background of the interviewer doing this, but I'm sharing these today because I want you to think about this in your answers, that typically a question, especially in a board interview, is not only at that singular monolithic level. Even I'm looking for additional things that you bring to the table and how you govern yourself and how you police yourself in the process of answering those things. It's a great way of getting an understanding of how that person would operate in the boardroom. All right, number 4, the learning mentality. I always say I don't know if I came up with this or I saw it somewhere. I don't take credit for things I haven't done myself, but I don't know. I just like the quote. Qualified is no longer a destination, but more so a continuous journey. And the main note here is to say that nobody likes a know-it-all. And it used to be, it's not as much anymore, but there are still folks out there that believe that once you've reached the level of board director, you've reached the epitome of your career. It doesn't require any more training or learning or education or coaching. And I am so far from that belief, because I believe the level of learning increases exponentially when you become a board director. So the learning mentality is a great way to understand whether I'm asking it from a nominating committee interview standpoint, or if you're not asked a question, you want to be able to infuse this in some way into the conversation, that you're prioritizing learning. Why? Because it shows that your involvement in board directorship you view as a discipline, not a hobby, number one. And this could compare back to certifications in addition to just education. You're understanding that the board vertical is quickly changing and evolving. This is true of most areas of business or expertise areas, but the board in the early, I'll even go back 10 years, it was not very open to adopting the fact or adapting to the fact that the board also was changing and the expectations were changing. It also shows commitment to your profession and the role of being a board director. And boards understand there's an increasing value to those companies being served by board directors that are on this path of continuous learning. In many cases, these are the deciding factors in not just the appointment of a board candidate, but also in the most robust decision-making and decisions that come out of boards. I believe it's based on education that's been gained in the last 2 to 3 years versus experiences and expertise from the previous 20 or 30 years. And if we look at this in terms of how you package yourself or how you balance your conversation, this kind of touches on 2 points. We talked about the high level packaging of a proper packaging of a board director or a board candidate earlier, but even above and beyond, you want to show and keep this balance also in your interviewing. So, and let me switch the side of the table for a moment. As an interviewer or working with a nominating committee or training a nominating committee to really drill down into a board candidate, I'm looking for a balance, and I call this your career trifecta. And it really works for any career or any industry, but I like to think it works even better in the board realm, because some of this has been ignored when we talk about the certification or the proof in a moment. So expertise, what you know, the theoretical aspect of what you know could be relating back to your education. It could be relating back to what you've learned. And then next is the experience. How have you applied that expertise, and what have you learned along the way? How have you enhanced that expertise along the way through your experience? And the third area, and really proof, and what I mean in this could be education, it could be training, it could be coaching, but I like to see this more so as certification. And you'll see this more and more so listed in the proxy disclosures from organizations on a yearly basis. They're starting to list more and more these certification, or what I like to call the proof of these directors. Just know that in any of your discussions and your responses, you're also keeping this balance of not just areas of what you know, but how you've applied it and how you can also prove the fact that you have above and beyond your expertise and your experience, you have a way to prove that you are an expert in those areas. So know that there's more and more emphasis being put, especially in the board space right now, on this certification area to show that you are treating your expertise and your knowledge, again, as a discipline, not just a hobby. And this is a prime way of doing that. So keep a balance in these areas when you're answering questions. Now, a good board interviewer, candidate interviewer knows that excellent board candidates are always searching for ways to increase their knowledge, even by serving on the board, and then have an opportunity to apply it, right? This in great board directors and great board candidates, it's a way to show that you have this passion for this industry, and you should view board directorship as an industry and even an industry vertical. So there's really 2 sides to this. One is you want to get across your insatiable appetite for learning, but you also want to ensure that the board, individual existing board members and the board itself is also an environment that pushes for learning for its board directors, whether that be through guest speakers coming in for the actual board meetings for a set amount of time, or the board is sponsoring, whether it be through the organization in terms of fees, the additional training or the certification of board members. So also these board interviewers know that board candidates who inherently allocate ample time for ongoing education and haven't forgotten that the current accelerating speed of change makes it a requirement for effective board directorship. So I will tell you, I'm extremely wary, once again, of any level, leadership level, especially at the board level, where they feel that there's really no more training for them and they've reached the epitome of their career. Those are extremely dangerous so-called leaders. Avoid them for the boards you join, and make sure that you're not one of those board candidates that thinks you've reached the epitome of your career. It's never the case. All right. And the 5th area, we're going to talk about what's called your other intelligences. And I focus very heavily on mindfulness intelligence and emotional intelligence. And let me just read you quickly 2 of the definitions that I've actually incorporated in my book. So remember that when we talk about emotional intelligence or emotional quotient, what we're really talking about is a leader's ability to recognize, understand, and manage their own emotions, along with the ability to recognize, understand, and influence the emotions of others. The reason that's important is that it allows for proper, well, I'm going to hold that thought in a moment because we're going to touch that. I'll come back to that. Now, if we just quickly touch on mindfulness intelligence, that definition is the process of bringing one's attention to the internal experiences occurring in the present moment. So it's sometimes odd to see someone who has great emotional intelligence, but does not have great mindfulness intelligence. And I don't really know what causes this gap, but it's someone who, yes, they're able to have empathy, but they're not able to apply it in the current moment. And we know many of these people, you've probably seen them. They don't know how to right size a conversation for what's happening or the risk that's at hand. They'll drone on and on for a while. I can do that during the webinar because I'm the only one speaking, but but typically you want to make sure that there's balances between these areas. And how does this look? So if we look at many of the intelligences or the quotients that I like to look at in the evaluation of board directors, it really falls across these 5 areas. I've in recent years added this adversity intelligence because if I had to break this down to another word, it's truly the grit of somebody. I found that you could have folks that have all the other intelligences, but they lack grit. And it's sometimes quite frustrating working on a team with those folks because they give up too early or they're not willing to put in the work that's required to get you to a sound outcome. But the reason I'm laser focused on these other intelligences, and especially EQ and MQ, is that great communication usually comes down to these 2 qualities: right sizing the content that you're discussing, raising the content to the proper level, reading the body language in the room, understanding why somebody may be reacting in a certain way or pushing back on something you're proposing, not taking the pushback personally and getting angry about it, but going in your mind to say, I wonder why this person is pushing back, and maybe even asking the question openly and not being angry or forceful in your responses in that way. You can see that these are all traits of somebody that can communicate properly and be part of the solution of driving a decision or a dilemma to conclusion, to a positive conclusion. A group that should really take this to heart right now is in politics, right? Every time I turn on the news or I see a speech being made, I can tell you I'm laser focused on their EQ and their MQ, and many times it's greatly lacking. And I just think that if there was some training that we could go through, or if they join my training, I'd be able to show them that these things are important. It's not just about what you're trying to forcefully push through, but you have to do it in a way that's very well balanced. A boardroom is about being a team. It's about communicating properly. This is why the importance of EQ and MQ is there. So for you as a board candidate, I would tell you one of a few things. One is make sure you're extremely aware of the definitions and the examples of EQ and MQ. Be very clear on a discussion. You're going to get the question of how do you communicate, or what is your leadership style, right? It's a dime a dozen, that question. What I'm saying, and I mentioned earlier, is that it's not just about, there's multiple levels to that answer. I would tell you to drive this down to a discussion about your EQ and your MQ and how you've honed that over the years and how you apply that as one of the core foundational tenets of your leadership style. That to me is super impressive when a candidate does that. And it's also something I recommend in my training courses, and applying this to actual examples that are real, that happened in your life, in your leadership experience. So keep this in mind and understand, again, you can drill down a little further on this with some of the links when you receive the presentation. Now, a couple things on communication, and then we'll move to some questions. Just remember again that board interviews are a two-way street. It's not just about you giving the right answer so they give you a yes and you're flattered and then you say yes, right? You're actually feeling them out just as much as they are feeling you out. And the communication component, I can't stress enough. Much can be deciphered when observing the interaction and communication style of a board by its individual members. And its individual members, whether you are given the opportunity to sit as an observer in the boardroom as a candidate or as a primary candidate or not, you're going to get a feel for this just based on your interaction with the board members you're meeting with or the nominating committee you're meeting with. Pay super close attention to see if the communication style is a cultural fit for you, because if you're not feeling it, you can already tell their values are not aligned to your values. There's a few things here I talk about. Are they truly mindful of one another, or you as a candidate? Is there emotion clouding otherwise sound decision making? Is there empathy? Is there openness to you voicing your opinion? And is there truly a deep sense of respect across the entire board? Now, again, if you don't get a chance to meet with the entire board in their meeting or in a board meeting, You should absolutely ask to meet with every single board member individually or as a group, as part of this, or in smaller groups. See how they interact, see how they communicate, see if they're respectful. And look also for this. This is something I've included in a few of the webinars I've done and the speaking I've done recently. So one of the most indicative qualities to observe in what would be considered as a highly functioning board is what I call respectful dissent. And a common example of this is if there is a board member, or even applying this to yourself, if you are outvoted on a voiced preference, outvoted by the remaining board, are you able to confidently say, I disagree, but I stand by the majority vote of this board and support the decision 100%? Because when the meeting is over and the vote is taken and decision is made, you cannot leave that room as a board member and voice that you were a dissenting viewpoint or voice that you're not in agreement with it. It's irrelevant. If the board decided that you are walking away in alignment with that. This is another great bellwether for you as a board candidate to ask what happens in the boardroom when you don't have a unanimous vote on something, and look for answers that talk about the explanation of it, and the fact also that there is some sort of effort to make sure that the board, or each individual board member, even those that voted no, still feel good about the decision afterwards because they were able to fully voice their opinion. Extremely important. You want to make sure that you're never on the receiving end of bad behavior or the missing of what's called respectful dissent. This all comes back to that EQ and MQ, or the other intelligences. This just happens to be a very prominent gap area for boards, or even the actions of individual board members. Look for this and make sure you are one of these people that's able to respectfully dissent, but also align with that board's decision. So a good interview will probe to see if you know that a team, especially a board, simply doesn't work well when one individual lacks mindfulness intelligence or emotional intelligence. I've seen boards where they bring in one new person and they're not a match for that board. They lack EQ or MQ, and it destroys the whole culture of the board, one person. And knowing also that, or the interviewer probing, or you bringing up your understanding that MQ and EQ are foundational to the inner workings and relational dynamic of all boards. That's really true of any team, all teams, right? They need that relational dynamic, but in boards, it's even more so extremely important. All right, so we're just about ready to get to some questions. I'll just throw in there quickly, if you're looking for the more formal approach and coaching and even the certification around the things I've mentioned today, it includes both the board operations as well as your proper packaging, board documents, preparing yourself even at a deeper level for the interviews, understanding and linking back values-based decisioning, all those particular areas. Please check out my website and click on the coaching and certification tab. I think you'll find this one of the most robust programs that's out there today. I also welcome you if you're interested in more of the architecture components of a board. I've written extensively about this. This book came out in 2018. It's, as I mentioned, it's in about 70 countries right now. This is a great way for you to understand the right questions to ask when you are on either side of the table, either as a candidate or a board member evaluating a board candidate, to understand if they know how a board should be built properly, or as a candidate, if it's a board you really want to join. I can tell you, if a board is not architected properly, it will be one of the worst experiences of your professional life to actually be seated on that board. All right, let's move to some of the questions. Let me go to those now. All right, hang on one second. You mentioned board documents instead of a resume or CV. I just touched on that a moment ago. So that particular question, just know when you get a link to this presentation, you can click on some of the articles that touch on that. You mentioned doing your homework on a company prior to an interview. Where do you find information? So, and you're asking, I'm assuming, specifically for public companies. So one of the things I like to see in a board candidate is that they are coming extremely prepared, and usually the way that they've done that is by looking back through the documents or the disclosures. That very easily can be proxy statements or annual reports, even drilling down into what's called your 10Ks, your 10Qs. and drilling down also into the website. Commonly, you're going to find some of the more recent and more immediate undertakings of the organization and maybe even the board, or at least the CEO, by visiting the website and articles that have been written recently. One of the things I like to also think of is the 8K form, or searching for an 8K form. Now, an 8K is required in the US to be filed for any material changes to the organization. And is expected to be filed within a certain number of days of something that is considered to be material to the organization. And I'm most impressed when I see a board candidate come in and they have something that was recently filed by, if indeed there was, something that was recently filed by the organization, and usually it's on the 8K, and they are able to correlate their expertise and their experience to help solution that problem both now and in the future. Commonly, the 8K is pointing out something that didn't go right. So it's another great way of adding in your expertise and showing the value you could bring to the board now. And by the way, that question also brings up the topic of speaking in the interview as if you are, without being coming across as cocky or presumptuous, but speaking as if you are on the board and you're already bringing value, right? Drive the conversation for them to actually view you as already a member of that board or a prime candidate to be on that board. It's a great way, again, of establishing your authority and getting credibility. So just know that some of the homework, again, for public companies, is it's extremely easy to get that data. Do you recommend observing a board as part of the process prior to joining a board? So I would say if you have the ability to do that, and many times nonprofits offer this up. Sometimes public companies or private companies, they feel that it's offering too much exposure for someone who's not on the board. I like to think that they can be crafty around that and maybe ask you to join for certain topics that the board is discussing, but maybe not others. There's always ways to do this. I will tell you, when it comes to you or I saying yes to a board, I think you should be the pickiest person in the world, because many board directors or candidates that say yes to the seat, 6 months in, they realize it was the wrong decision, but all the indicators were there for them earlier. And now they realize the risk to them is much greater. I can tell you, I say no a hell of a lot more to offered board seats than I say yes. And it is commonly by observing the things I've mentioned in today's webinar. It's looking for the interaction and the communication style between board members, looking at the level of involvement. Are they viewing this as truly a significant time commitment versus a hobby where I'm going to get involved as I have available time? And that's not just for nonprofits where you see that in private and public organizations too. So to the question of if you can observe the board, there's nothing wrong with asking that question, in your interview. And there's definitely, if you have the ability to join, I would say absolutely do it and see how effective, how efficient, see how respectful the board is to one another, and see what they're actually accomplishing during that time together. There's a question here. Please give examples of each type of question. You know what I'll do? This came in from Michael. If you want, because there's so many examples of this, maybe we could speak offline of that. But just know when I'm talking about the difference between a strategic or governance conversation versus tactics, I already know if I give an example of something that's very task-oriented, or I'm driving to, or I'm in a discussion with a board candidate and they keep reverting back to nitty-gritty tasks and not driving those back to examples of strategy or milestones of rolled up tasks, I already know that it's likely that that person doesn't have enough experience or needs more training in their understanding of leadership versus management. But Michael, if you want to speak more about that offline, we can. How many interviews are typical? A good question. I just realized I haven't covered that in my webinar, so I appreciate the question. This does vary by organization and by board. It will also depend on the vetting process. So if there is a search or placement firm that's involved, many times they can get through a lot of the earlier stage vetting of a potential board candidate. And then, of course, it has to do with the internal protocol. Some nominating committees I work with and I recommend, the processes to, I tell them they should never make a decision with less than 3 separate interviews on different days and different times. It just allows for a more in-depth understanding of that person. Can they be on time, right? How are they dressed? Are they consistent? Those types of things above and beyond what I would view as just leadership traits or experience. But I would commonly say in this that once you get to the organization itself and you're through, if it did go through a placement or vetting organization, I would commonly say to expect a minimum of 3 and be wary of those organizations that are not interviewing you 3 or more times, right? Because what does that mean? They're making a very hasty decision on you, which means they did that for every other board member you're going to be sitting with. Do you want to be sitting on a team that didn't earn it, or was the decision was hasty in saying yes for them to join the board? I can tell you this is part of that two-way street of understanding if the board is truly effective and efficient, and are you going to be successful there? The last thing to mention about that, remember that these indicators also have a direct correlation back to risk. And when I say risk, I'm talking about formal indemnification by the organization, formal D&O insurance and their coverage, right? And then even to what's viewed as somewhat of a supplemental or an IDL or independent director liability insurance, which many directors carry for themselves. Use these indicators in the interview as a way of you not just being the person being interviewed, it's also you interviewing that board. Extremely important. It lowers your risk, and you do not want to be on the receiving end of a lawsuit or a suit that's coming to a board and realizing that the operations of the board were not correct and you're liable for that. Not a good way to do it. All right, let me see. Board of service organizations. I will. The question has to do with thoughts on different types of board placement organizations or search organizations. I will tell you this very quickly, so we stay on our time frame right now. When it comes to what I said earlier about you creating your board director brand, what you're looking to do in your branding and establishing your authority and setting yourself up as someone who is in control of your destiny of board directorship, think of it in the following way. You want to remain as the hub or the center circle of your world when it comes to your packaging and your marketing for landing board seats. And if you think of that as yourself as the hub and you control all those things, then you have your spokes off of that. One spoke is looking at maybe different placement or search organizations, right? It's not your primary, it's one of your spokes or one of your control areas off your hub. Another is establishing your authority through hosting webinars or joining panel discussions or networking in organizations above and beyond just being a member and you pay your dues every year. You want to remain that central hub and keep control of it. Everything else is a tool on the tool belt and another way for you to expand that authority. So first and foremost, I don't view the only way of landing a board seat, and quite frankly, the percentage of folks landing board seats through placement agencies, big and small, is nowhere near the success of somebody actually taking control of that themselves and looking at this in a much more holistic way. In the program I mentioned earlier, the coaching and the certification, I go into all of this. I mentioned also about how do you create this brand? How do you establish your authority? And then how do you integrate that in with your marketing? And don't view marketing as a way of saying that, you're out there selling your efforts. It's really about establishing your authority and doing it in a way that allows you to show that you are truly a force that is in the board director vertical. So I see we're just about out of time. I appreciate everybody joining today. If you have other questions, please email me directly. I'll have a link out to everybody shortly in the next day or so to the recording of the webinar and also to the presentation, which you can download directly if you'd like to do that. The links are in there. I thank everybody so much for joining. Take a look for our next webinar. When you get the link, you can sign up for next month's as well. That'll be on the topic of board director compensation and remuneration. Another great topic. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope to see you soon. Bye now.